She never expected her whole life to change because of a simple act of kindness. One moment she was a waitress scraping by on tips, just trying to make it through another shift. The next her world was crumbling, fired, humiliated, left with nothing. And it all started with one customer, a man she didn't even know. A man who, as it turned out, had the power to flip her entire future upside down, because the day after she lost everything, something happened that no one saw coming. And by the time the truth came out, the people who tried to destroy her were begging for forgiveness. But it was already too late. Maggie had been working at Rosie's diner for nearly 4 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, barely. Her shifts were long, the customers were rude, and the manager watched her like a hawk, waiting for the tiniest mistake. That night, the place was packed. Orders kept piling up, the kitchen was running behind, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. And that's when he walked in. A man in a simple button-down shirt, looking like any other customer. He took a seat at the far end of the counter, quiet, polite, nothing out of the ordinary. Maggie barely had time to glance at him before rushing to the next table. But then, she heard it. The table next to him, 2 men in suits were talking. Not talking, mocking. And they were mocking him. Can you believe that guy walks in here like he's one of us, like he belongs here? Maggie didn't know what they meant at first, but then she caught the way they looked at him, the way they sneered, and it made her sick. She didn't know who he was, didn't care. All she knew was that they were treating him like garbage for no reason, and she wasn't about to let that happen. So she did something she wasn't supposed to do, something that would cost her everything. Maggie didn't hesitate. She walked over to the man and smiled, treating him just like any other customer, maybe even a little kinder, just to spite the men who were whispering behind his back. "Welcome to Rosie's. What can I get you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He looked up, gave a polite smile, and ordered a coffee. Simple, no fuss. But the men at the next table weren't done yet. "You sure you can afford that, buddy?" One of them snickered. "Or should we start a fundraiser for you?" Maggie clenched her jaw. She knew men like this. They had the expensive suits, the air of arrogance, the belief that the world revolved around them. And they had decided that this quiet man, sitting alone at the counter, was beneath them. She glanced at him, waiting for him to react. But he didn't. He just stirred his coffee, like he hadn't heard a thing. That was when Maggie made her choice. She turned to the 2 men and called them out. "You know," she said, keeping her voice light, "we have a rule here at Rosie's. We only serve people with manners. Maybe I should bring you a kids menu instead." The 2 men froze. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by a waitress. For a second she thought they might lash out, but then they just sneered, muttered something under their breath, and stormed out. Maggie smirked. Problem solved. Or so she thought. She turned back to the quiet man, expecting a chuckle or a thank you. Instead, he just gave her a small, almost knowing smile. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She shrugged. "I don't like bullies." And that was it. She refilled his coffee and went back to work, not realizing that those 2 men weren't just random customers. They were friends of the owner, and they weren't about to let Maggie get away with embarrassing them. Not even an hour later, she was pulled into the back office. Her manager, Mark, was waiting for her. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. "Maggie, what the hell did you do?" he snapped. She frowned. "What are you talking about? You insulted 2 of our most important customers. They called the owner and demanded you be fired." Immediately, Maggie's heart stopped. "They were harassing a customer," she defended. I don't care." Mark cut her off. "You're done here." And just like that, she was fired, over a cup of coffee. She walked out of that diner with her last paycheck in hand, the weight of reality crashing down on her. She had bills to pay, rent was due in a week, and now she had nothing. But what Maggie didn't know was that her story was far from over, because the man she had defended, he wasn't just any customer, and the next day, her life was about to take an unbelievable turn. Maggie barely slept that night. She lay awake in her tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she'd survive the next few weeks. The job at Rosie's wasn't much, but it had been something, and now it was gone, just because she stood up for a stranger. By morning, her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. Rent is due in 5 days. No excuses. She groaned, rubbing her temples. She needed a plan. Fast. With a sigh, she got up, pulled on her jacket, and decided to walk to the nearest cafe. Maybe some fresh air would clear her mind. But the second she stepped outside, she noticed something strange. People were staring at her, whispering. A few even had their phones out, like they were recording her. Her stomach twisted. What was going on? Then, as she reached the coffee shop, she spotted a newspaper on a table, and her heart nearly stopped, because right there on the front page was her face, and next to it, a headline that made her knees go weak. Waitress fired for helping us, Vice President. Internet explodes over unbelievable act of kindness. Vice President. Maggie snatched up the paper, her hands shaking as she scanned the article. The quiet man from the diner, the one she had defended. It was J.D. Vance, a U.S. Vice President. She hadn't just stood up for some random guy. She had unknowingly defended one of the most powerful men in the country. And now, the entire world knew about it. Her phone started buzzing, non-stop, messages, missed calls, social media notifications flooding in so fast, her screen kept freezing. She opened Twitter. #Justice for Maggie was trending. Her story had spread like wildfire overnight. People were furious that she had been fired just for standing up to two arrogant businessmen. Celebrities were tweeting about her. News channels were running the story. Strangers were sending messages of support, some even offering her money. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get any crazier, her phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. She hesitated, then opened it. "Maggie, this is J.D. Vance. I need to talk to you. Call me when you can." Her heart pounded. Was this real? She quickly typed back, "Is this really you?" A few seconds later, another text popped up. "Yes. And I have a job offer for you." Maggie stared at the screen, barely able to breathe. Yesterday she had been fired, humiliated, left with nothing. And now a U.S. Vice President was offering her a job. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning, because the men who got her fired, they were watching, and they weren't happy. Maggie's hands trembled as she stared at the message from J.D. Vance. A job? Why? What kind of job? Was this even real? Her mind raced as she typed back, "What kind of job?" Seconds later, her phone buzzed again. "Meet me for coffee. Let's talk in person. I think you'll want to hear this." She hesitated. Was this really happening? Less than 24 hours ago, she was scraping by as a waitress. Now a U.S. senator wanted to meet with her. She glanced at her nearly empty fridge, then at the overdue bills stacked on the counter. What choice did she have? With a deep breath, she typed, "Okay, when and where?" His response came immediately. "Noon. Cafe on 5th. I'll see you there." Maggie exhaled sharply. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she was about to find out. When Maggie walked into the cafe, she spotted him immediately. J.D. Vance sat at a small table near the window, wearing the same simple button-down from the diner. He looked up as she approached and smiled. "Maggie," he said, standing up and offering his hand. "I'm glad you came." She shook his hand, still feeling like she was in a dream. I wasn't expecting all this," she admitted, sliding into the seat across from him. He chuckled. "Neither was I." Before she could say anything else, he leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "You did something yesterday that not many people would have done," he said. "You stood up for a stranger, and because of that you lost your job." Maggie nodded slowly. "Yeah, guess that's life, huh?" His eyes darkened. It shouldn't be. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just sat there waiting. And then he dropped the bombshell. "I want to offer you a job," he said. "Not charity. A real job." Maggie blinked. "Doing what?" He smiled. "Working for me." Her heart stopped. "What?" "I need someone like you," JD continued. "Someone who's not afraid to speak up. Someone who sees people, not status, not power, just people." Maggie swallowed hard. "I don't know anything about politics." He shook his head. "You don't have to. I just need someone I can trust. Someone who can help me stay connected to real people." She stared at him, still struggling to process everything. Yesterday, she was fired from a dead-end job. Today she was sitting across from a U.S. vice president, and he was offering her a new future. But before she could say yes, someone else walked into the cafe, and everything changed again. The enemy strike back. Maggie didn't notice them at first. She was too focused on J.D. Vance, too overwhelmed by what he was saying. But then the air shifted. A chill ran down her spine, and when she looked up, she saw them. The two men from the diner, the ones who had mocked the ones who had gotten her fired, and they weren't alone. A third man, older, sharper, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes, stood beside them. He was staring right at Maggie, her stomach twisted. J.D. noticed. He followed her gaze, and the second he saw them, his expression darkened. Maggie leaned in, lowering her voice. "Who are they?" J.D. exhaled slowly. "Trouble." The men walked toward them, stopping just a few feet from their table. The older man spoke first. His voice was smooth, but laced with something dangerous. "You're making quite a name for yourself, Miss Harper." Maggie's mouth went dry. J.D. squared his shoulders. "Leave her alone." The older man ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on Maggie. "I have to say, I was disappointed to hear that you were meeting with the vice president. You see, there are people who don't appreciate what you did yesterday." Maggie's pulse pounded. "What do you want?" she asked. The man smiled. "A warning," he said. "Stay out of things you don't understand." J.D.'s jaw clenched. "Is that a threat?" The man gave a slow, deliberate shrug. "Just some advice." Then he turned and walked away, the two men from the diner following close behind. Maggie exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. J.D. leaned closer. His voice was low, serious. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I won't blame you if you walk away." Maggie stared after the men. She thought about how easily they had gotten her fired, how they had tried to ruin her, and now they wanted her to stay quiet. Her fingers curled into fists. She looked J.D. Vance in the eye, and made her decision. "When do I start?" J.D. Vance studied Maggie for a moment, as if gauging whether she truly understood what she was getting into. Then slowly, he nodded. "You start now." Maggie took a deep breath. No turning back. J.D. reached into his jacket, and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "Inside are details about your new role. You'll be part of my public outreach team. You'll help me stay connected to people who don't have a voice, the working class, the forgotten, the ones who need real change." Maggie flipped the folder open. Inside was an official contract, a real salary, more than she had ever made in her life. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced down. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" At first there was silence, then a voice low, serious. "You should have listened." Maggie's heart stopped, then a click. The call ended. She looked up at J.D., her hands shaking. "That was them," she whispered. J.D.'s jaw tightened. "They're trying to scare you." Maggie clenched her teeth. "Well, it's not going to work." J.D. studied her, then smirked. "Good." But deep down Maggie knew, this was only the beginning. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She had stepped into something bigger, something that powerful people didn't want her to be part of. And if they thought a few threats would make her back down, they were dead wrong. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.